everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It's Monday, November 28th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. So, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but last weekend was the second annual SciComm camp. Now, this is a weekend-long retreat that a couple of friends of mine and I, Jason Goldman, Sarah Curtis, and I started 2 years ago. So this was our second one, and it's an opportunity for science communicators of all stripes to take a weekend to get to know one another, to network, to learn from one another, and really just make new friends in their field. You know, a lot of us are freelancers, so we work from home and we don't often get a chance to work together. But some people who go to SciComm camp are career professionals who actually work in offices. They may work at NASA, they may work at universities in the outreach department, or even within their own lab, and they just want to improve their ability to communicate their own science. So it's a super cool event. You get to meet people of all different stripes, from people who are just starting out in their careers, graduate students, or, you know, recent grads, all the way up to people who have been doing it for decades and decades. I was really excited because one of my good friends who I've known for many years, Brian Malow, was in attendance. Now, he is a science communicator now, but he's not a scientist. He's actually a stand-up comedian. And more recently, his comedy has sort of morphed into this science-y comedy that he actually can use to help train other science communicators with better stage presence and, you know, feeling more confident in their communication skills. I am super excited because he was able to chat with me after the weekend, and I am going to play that conversation for you shortly. But first, I do want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Now, remember, there are a lot of ways to support the show. If you visit my website, carasantamaria.com, you can find out about all of them. This week, through the Patreon portal at www.patreon.com/talknerdy, here are my top supporters: Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Jeffrey Perez, Ron Cano Block, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Stuart Ogg, The Honorable Husband, Charles Payette, Jafe, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. Thank you guys so very much. Oh, I also forgot to ask my American listeners, how was your Thanksgiving? Other people don't celebrate that. That's a very, specifically American holiday. But I do notice that some of the turkey dinners bleed into some like pubs and restaurants around the world. Mine was good because I did not hang out with family and did not have to talk about Donald Trump with anyone. It was a Friendsgiving, and it was an awful lot of fun, and I'm really grateful to have been able to do that. All right, guys, I think that it's time to jump right in. So I already mentioned my guest this week. His name is Brian Malow. He is the science comedian. He's been doing comedy for over 2 decades. But he's worked in SciComm a lot more recently, including 4 years at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh, doing outreach there, and also producing videos for Time Magazine, blogging for Scientific American. And now he's gone fully freelance. Gasp! He also gives talks to scientists on communicating science to the public, and I was really honored to be able to sit down and speak with him. So here he is, Brian Malow. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Cara.
I'm so excited. So we actually just got to hang out this weekend at the second annual SciComm camp.
And I'm so glad I didn't get to go. I think I had a conflict last year, but I wanted to go. So I registered at the moment registration opened. I was on it, and I got in, and I was very happy.
We were so excited. So for people who don't know, I think I may have mentioned it on the show before, but 2 friends of mine and I, Jason Goldman and Sarah Curtis, Jason, who's been on the show a couple times, Sarah, why haven't I had her on the show? I need to have her on. The 3 of us a couple of years ago were like bemoaning the fact that we didn't have a sort of community, a sort of gathering for people who work in science communication, many of whom are freelancers, many of whom don't often have an opportunity to spend time with colleagues and collaborate with them. So we were like, screw it, we'll just make one. Which is a crazy thing to say. And so we kind of endeavored to make this weekend-long camp, sort of a retreat, not quite a conference, really hard to explain what it is because it's not as sophisticated and definitely not in like a conference center, like the airport Marriott, like a lot of professional conferences.
Right. No, it didn't feel like a conference.
No, it's actually at a campground in Malibu, with sort of bunks, like campy style bunks, but kind of nicer than a typical, cabin.
More like a hotel room than a cabin, but like a real bare hotel room.
Yeah, like a rustic hotel
Yeah.
room. But then with all the standard camp facilities, like a mess hall and, different little rooms where you could gather and a lawn outside where you can play. We did, a stargazing event with Celestron. We did a great story collider event with National Geographic, and had all these great sessions where people could learn from each other, teach one another, and just collaborate and get to be friends and reconnect. Sometimes we have this issue in science communication where we know a lot of other science communicators, be it journalists or TV personalities or podcasters or public information officers at universities or people who do outreach at NASA, what have you.
Yeah.
We know them all, but we only know them online.
Right.
Yeah. And so being able to get together is really, really fun. And so we were lucky enough that you, Brian, wanted to come to the event and that you also were willing to do a set for us.
Yeah. I wanted to. In fact, you know what? Have we introduced me?
No, but I will have introduced. See, this is the great thing about podcasting. I will have introduced you before we go.
Okay.
But this is my meandering way.
Yeah, okay, cool.
That's how we do. So for people who don't know or didn't know what it meant when I said at the top of the show that you are the science comedian, you are the science comedian. What exactly does that mean? What does it mean to be a science comedian?
It's funny because people ask that often, and that you don't question what a political comedian is, and it's really pretty comparable, analogous, and other synonyms. It's I was a comedian I'm not a scientist. I'm a science enthusiast, and I have been from the earliest age. When I try to back engineer my career, I say this, I'm not 100% certain about it, but I say that I think science fiction got me into science, and especially the science fiction I liked is called hard SF, and where the science is important, central to the story, and the accuracy of it is important. So Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, this guy Larry Niven, I was reading this sort of classic science fiction, and Asimov and Clarke wrote a lot of nonfiction. Asimov wrote way more nonfiction than science fiction, actually.
Yeah.
And their science writing was really good. And with Asimov in particular, he wrote with personality and often humor. So I think that's one of my biggest influences. So at the earliest age, I was into science and science fiction. I found my way into stand-up comedy. And I was just your standard comedian like everyone else. I mostly worked comedy clubs, sometimes colleges, sometimes corporate gigs.
Were you young when you first started doing stand-up?
Not that young. I actually, after I graduated, I went to graduate school. This was all at the University of Texas in Austin. I went to graduate school.
I forgot you went to UT.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Wait, you did too.
No, I didn't go to UT, but I'm from Texas. I went to UNT.
That's right. That's right. You're from the Dallas area.
Yeah.
You're from Denton, right?
I went to college in Denton. I'm from Plano, Texas, but I went to college in Denton, which is where UNT is. But I spend obviously a lot of time in Austin. I have lots of family in Austin. I'm actually going there in a month to speak at a panel with Michio Kaku and who else is going to be on it? Brian Greene. Just a cool physics panel. But anyway, that's besides the point. What did you study in school?
Well, you know what? At UT Austin, because if I tell you my major, it was Plan 2, which is
I know what Plan 2
is. University. Yeah,
but
it's a liberal arts honors program.
Yeah, it's for all the smart kids at UT.
You had to first get accepted. I grew up in Houston, and you had to first get accepted to the UT and then apply separately to this program. And what it meant was, University of Texas is a huge state school. If you take an English class, there's probably 50 or 100 people in it. But my English class had a dozen people in it, and arguably we had a much better teacher too. So I was so my degree is actually it's a liberal arts degree, but especially under the influence of my Jewish parents, I was pre-med. So within this program, there were a lot of electives. So I took, chemistry and organic chemistry, and I had actually, my high school was really good in Houston too, and I took physics and calculus my senior year, and I placed out of the physics that was required for medical school. So, and this is kind of sad to me. So I never took any math or physics in college, which I actually would have liked, but I didn't need to, you know?
Mhm.
And part of the reason of that was not only that I took a fairly advanced physics class my senior year of high school, but I had already been learning physics from Isaac Asimov and other science writers. We learned more extracurricularly, me and my geeky friends, than we did in school, really. So have a pretty good physics background for that level, not at
Yeah.
the master's level, not at the PhD level, but just pretty good general physics education. And that was my favorite subject, physics and astronomy. But I
What
got a
did you
liberal arts degree, and then actually was out for a year, and then I went to graduate school in TV production. So I
Oh,
started
cool.
doing, and
Okay.
it was while I was in graduate school that I saw a sign for the funniest person in Austin contest, and I had been thinking of it, and I had a couple jokes in mind. And so I did 2 open mic nights, and then I did the competition, and I did pretty well in it, and I was hooked.
And so that was before your comedy had taken on this scientific tone. At the time, you were just doing what was personal comedy to you,
Yeah,
observational comedy.
but from the beginning, it was obvious that I was kind of geeky. I had early jokes that were kind of science. There's a voice that I think I'm only finally really coming into my own, and you can't say perfected, but that's for any artist.
Hmm.
Your trajectory is about finding your unique voice. Um, you know, you get influenced by a lot of other artists, and then somewhere in there, hopefully you find your way to pick the best of your influences, and somehow it leads you to something that's uniquely you.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, it was there. Like when it was only about 9 years ago that I came up with the phrase science comedian.
Hmm.
And I was surprised to find that the domain sciencecomedian.com was available, which I took to mean either that's a really good sign or it's a really bad sign, like useless real estate. But one of my old comedy friends, when we were talking about it, we laughed because he goes, "We knew you were the science comedian 10 years before that."
Isn't that funny how it's so obvious sometimes to the outside world?
Yeah.
But like learning about your own personality or your
Yeah.
own interests can sometimes take a lot longer.
Absolutely. And I hinted around it. There were things in my promo material early on. I had a line that was like, he has more science jokes than the average comedian, or I really did, like I was like just on the periphery of it, but it didn't crystallize until that phrase came into my head, science comedian. And then once I got that domain and thought about it, I cut the other stuff away. And but I also, you started by asking me, what does that even mean, science comedian?
Hmm.
And I got to tell you, I have a very broad definition for science comedy, because early on somebody contacted me and they go, "Oh, science comedian. So you teach children about science using comedy." And I said, "Oh, no, no, no. If you're a geek, I'll make you laugh."
Yeah.
Very
I
different.
would say that a fair amount of your material is probably not appropriate for children. Although I'm sure you could do a set that was kid friendly.
yeah.
I've definitely seen sets where kids should not be in the room.
Yeah. But frankly, most of my stuff is clean now, but it's inappropriate because it's just too high level. It's like if the punchline is the phrase conservation of mass, or if the
Yeah.
punchline is, depends on you knowing what endothermic means, then it's not going to be for the youngest kids.
That's
So
true.
I feel like my audience is adults and young adults, but adults of all ages, college kids, maybe, and high school kids and middle school kids. I can reach them if they like science.
Yeah.
If they don't already like science, then they probably won't like me that much. But if they were like I was in middle school, or what we used to call junior high, then I think I would have liked this stuff.
Well, the
So
funny thing is that kids, like younger, kids who are in middle school or high school, actually are more acutely aware of science than a lot of adults, right? Because they're actively taking the
yeah.
classes. So even if they're not heavily into it, if you make references to like Schrodinger's cat. Like they'll kind of know what that means because they will
More
have
likely
heard
than
about
an
it.
adult, yeah.
Yeah, isn't that funny? Even if they're like, ugh, I don't like science, they're at least like in it in a way that
Yeah.
adults sometimes aren't.
That's a funny thing. I once was talking to, I had a live streaming video talk show back at the dawn of time in 1999 and 2000, years before
Wow.
YouTube. It was the time when there wasn't video on the web,
Yeah, was
but
it
there was an
dial-up?
explosion. Well, yeah, but and DSL. There was an
Okay.
explosion of animation. Flash animation was
Yes.
exploding on the web.
Yes,
and
like
I got
a
with this
Homestar
company.
Runner, like Strong Bad, and all of those.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, there were so many great websites back then. Okay,
And I
anyway.
got with a company. They were called Play. They're gone now, but they were called Play Incorporated, and they formed this thing called. And they had broken off from New Tech, which is a company that still makes really interesting production tools and streaming tools.
Mhm.
So some of them broke off and formed this company Play and Play TV. And I was one of 6 shows on a network. And the thing with all those companies is there weren't enough eyeballs. There weren't enough people watching video yet. We sent out 2 streams. One was, this will be meaningless to some people, but it was a 56K dial-up stream, and the other was a 300K for DSL. And they looked good, and we had a kind of green screen technology, and it was the technology that Play made it so I could be a one-man band. And so I had a little support, but I actually ran the show, and I switched. It was a multi-camera, and if I was interviewing you, you'd be sitting across from me, and I had keyboard shortcuts. So I would be talking to you and focused on you, but my fingers were resting on the keyboard, and I could cut to your camera, cut to mine. Then I could cut to another screen and pull up your book or your website or an instant message via a system that was called ICQ. It was an Israeli company and an early instant messaging program.
That's so smart. I want to do that now.
Yeah, it was very cool. And there's tools for this now. Well, the amazing thing is this required a certain amount of technology, but not a lot. It was reducing the cost of production immensely. But today, in the palm of your hand, wirelessly on your phone, you can stream live video right to Facebook or Periscope. So it's amazing how far it's come. Some of my colleagues from back then have seen me stream live video, and we've just been there remarking, it's like, wow, look how far it's come in 15 years. We
That's
didn't
true.
foresee this. But what was the question? What
I don't
were we actually
remember.
talking about? I have a rambling way myself, so
We're
believe
talking
me.
about science comedy. You know what? I do want to
Oh,
ask
yes,
you.
what
You were
science
talking about
comedies?
some of the authors that influenced you, kind of
Yeah.
the hard sci-fi early on. I'm wondering how you felt about, and if you loved it as much as I did, about The Martian when it came out recently.
Yes.
Because didn't it have that vibe to it?
Yes. And okay, so let's hold that thought 1 second, because the only
Okay.
thing I want to say is that my broad definition of I do have material now. I have become passionate about science communication and education, and I love to turn people onto ideas. People always thought, you should be a teacher. And it's like, well, are you saying that I shouldn't be a comedian? Is that your underhanded compliment that I should be a teacher instead? But I do
No.
like making turning people on to interesting science concepts and making it clear and making it funny. But some of my jokes are just silly, and they just borrow the language and metaphors from science, and I just use them to be silly. So some jokes aren't that educational. My definition of science comedy is broad that way. You will learn some stuff and you'll laugh a lot, and some of it's just silliness in a kind of geeky flavor.
But I think that's important if you're going to be sitting through a comedy show, right? Like you need the things that just make you laugh instantly, like the non-thinkers. And then the
Yeah.
thinky jokes that are a little bit deeper and have a few layers to them are also really meaningful and they really stick with you. But you have to
Yes.
sort of go back and forth and oscillate between those things, because if it's too deep and heavy, you're not going to get what's kind of the golden rule, isn't it? Something crazy like a laugh every 5 seconds. Like you need
yeah.
you want to get people laughing a lot, and that's just really hard if you're spending so much time with setup. So
And
you
you know
need to
what's-
be able to oscillate.
I think early on when people heard the phrase science comedian, it's a love or hate thing. They either immediately like the idea and want to hear more, or they may have a bad taste in their mouth because
Yeah.
when they hear science comedy, they think, oh, this is some scientist who thinks he's funny. And I'm coming at it the other way. I'm not a scientist. I just love science. I am a comedian with a couple decades of stand-up comedy experience. So I'm a comedian who chooses the realm of science to work within.
Yeah, which is
So I
great
am
because
a
it's also
comedian.
a good niche, like n- not for nothing, but a lot of comedians do work within a similar kind of venue or alley, right? Lane, I
Right.
guess I could say.
Yes.
So they'll do
Yeah.
observational comedy, or they'll do like I'm sick of being married jokes, or they'll
Yeah.
do like ethnic jokes, or whatever the case may be. And hopefully they have their own spin and their own flavor. And some people are really giants in those areas,
Yeah,
and some people
absolutely.
are less so. But I don't know of really any other science comedians. I know of some comedians who are smart and some comedians who like to do sort of geeky, like a Dimitri Martin sort of geeky
Uh-huh.
vibe when they do their comedy. But science comedy is like so great because it's really niche.
Thanks. Yeah. You know what's funny? Have you heard of this philosopher? I met him at the Sci-Fu conference back in
Mhm.
2008, which is, if people, it's just this amazing, also unconference
Mhm.
that Nature and Google and O'Reilly Media put on at the Googleplex. And his name's Nick Bostrom. And a lot of science people know who he is because he's a philosopher. He's English, I think. And he talks about early on, there's a topic that's come up recently. He was talking about this 10 years ago about whether we live in a simulation
Yeah.
and this kind of stuff. He's talking about that kind of stuff and existential risks from horrible viruses to meteorites and he was talking about this stuff 10 years ago, if not more. And I remember when I met him, we had this funny conversation where he was really taken with the idea. So I was fairly fresh as calling myself a science comedian then. And he's like, that's wonderful. And he's like, but you know what? It's such a niche now. But one
Mhm.
day, perhaps it'll be so, give it time. And then there'll be so many more that to call yourself a science comedian would be so like broad as to be crude. It's like there will be upper respiratory system comedians and just digestive system comedians. You know what I mean? Like there will be so much specialization that to even
Yeah.
just call yourself a science comedian would be like, oh, that's crude and
String
uninteresting.
theory comedians. That's
Exactly.
awesome.
Fast forward 20 or 30 years and let's see what the entire genre of science comedy looks like. And I thought that was hilarious, but I don't want it to happen because I do not it's like I did come up with this early enough to get sciencecomedian.com, and of course I don't want anyone working in my realm, but
No,
I
and
do like
sure.
the idea of science entertainment though.
And I like
Science and
the
art, the intersection of science and art is beautiful.
Absolutely. And we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing it with things like Story Collider. We're seeing it with
Yes.
incredible science artists,
Oh yeah.
illustrators, musicians,
Yes.
across the board. But I do love this idea that science is a sort of type of geekdom that is to be celebrated. That,
Yes.
I consider myself a nerd. I consider myself a geek. And even though I'm not like a huge kind of fantasy and soft sci-fi fan. I like the harder
Mhm.
sci-fi too.
Me
It
too.
speaks to me a little more. Even though I'm not really into like comic book heroes and things like
Nope.
that, that doesn't mean I'm not a geek. I'm like a
Yeah.
huge science nerd. And so
Yeah, agreed. Like I was never a comic book guy, but
Mhm.
you can't question my geek credentials because I was reading science fiction books and short stories obsessively and science books.
Yeah.
So I'm just not, it's just a different flavor of geekiness.
Absolutely. So yeah, getting back to that question about The Martian, how did you
Yeah.
like it?
I loved it. I didn't read it, but I'm interested in reading it. It's just that it's a book, and it turns out we don't read that many books. I'm saying we to deflect the guilt, but
Yeah.
I was a voracious reader, and now I sure do read a lot of articles that I find links to on Twitter and Facebook. But I still read a lot, but I am going to get back to reading more. And in fact, in 2015. I did go through a little craze, and I read a decent number of books in 2015, but not in 2016.
Yeah, well, if it makes you feel better, I read The Martian like before the movie came out, which
Really?
was
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, because I didn't even know that the movie was there. I think I've mentioned this on the show before, so I didn't know that Matt Damon was cast yet. So I
Ah,
didn't. Mark Watney in my head was not Matt Damon. He was
right.
a character in a book who I invented what he looked like inside
Right.
my own mind. So it was super cool to be able to have that and then have him translate into Matt Damon, who, by the way, was incredible casting. But
He
two
was
things.
fantastic. Yeah.
Incredible. Two things. One, the book is so much richer than the film. The film is
Good.
incredible, but there's only so much you can do in 2
Right.
hours, and there's so much they had to leave out because of the time constraints. So right there, that makes it worthwhile. And two, I am an incredibly slow reader.
Uh-huh.
Historically, I just have a really hard time. I like to read for comprehension and content, which
Yes.
means I'm just not good at reading quickly. And that
Yeah.
book was still like I finished it in just a few days because it's such a page turner.
I want to read it. I first of all, I love Ridley Scott.
Mhm.
Um, I like Matt Damon, okay, but especially I loved him in The Bourne Identity, the first
Yeah.
one, but yeah. So this as a science fiction film, it's weird. It's like it just seemed weird to call it science fiction. Obviously, science
Right?
fiction because we've never sent people to Mars.
But it's
But
so
it's just that it
soon.
doesn't feel like science fiction. It feels like just barely near future. Nothing. There were no made up aliens. There was no. It was. It was so reasonable. The science and engineering is just a couple steps beyond where we are. And arguably, it's not even beyond where we are. It's a financial thing that prevents us from being there.
Doesn't that blow your mind?
Yeah.
Like thinking about the fact that you're watching this movie and it's like, of course, this is insane. This is the first guy on this planet and blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, oh, yeah, this is going to happen like probably within my lifetime.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
nutty.
and it's too bad if we weren't so obsessed with the military budget being what it is. I always think it's not only just the military. A lot of people like to point fingers at that, but I think of all the money we spend on military
Hmm.
and advertising. Like advertising, I mean, there are amazing advertisements, the technology that goes in, but just think not just the money and the talent in those two industries. If that was applied to just art and science, what a different world it would be.
Yeah, like if we took all of the money that we spend in trying to make money and
Yeah.
instead spent it trying to like better humanity.
Yeah. So I
Yeah, we
loved
might
it.
see a
And
big difference.
that core idea of, you know, he looks at his situation and he's so clearly completely fucked. There's absolutely the habitat isn't designed to last more than months. The food there
Yeah.
isn't there. It's like he sums up his situation and it's absolutely completely hopeless. And then, which is what astronauts have to do, and probably any kind of test pilot, or I
Hmm.
mean, there's some other kinds of things, but what astronauts have to do is just like they did on Apollo 13. It's like, oh shit, you're very vulnerable. You're completely screwed. Okay, set that aside and start doing everything you can do. Catalog all your assets and get to work. And even though you think it's hopeless, are you going to sit around and just think it's hopeless? And he just starts, that's how he occupies his time. Let's see what I can do.
That is a great metaphor for how I think a lot of scientists and a lot of kind of liberal and progressive thinkers are feeling right now after the American
Oh,
election. It's such a good metaphor because, we were concerned about this doing SciComm camp this weekend. Obviously, we never even thought about it last year when we picked the date and we were
right.
planning it. And of course, then we start getting calls and emails from people leading up to camp like, are we going to have a special session to talk about Trump? Are we going to be able to talk about how to mobilize now and blah, blah. And we had to make a conscious effort to say, you know what? I think that conversation is going to be had anyway in the hallways, in the rooms around the campfire. We have certain sessions that are specifically geared towards things like countering misconceptions in the public, like, improving relations between SciComm and industry, like all these different things. Like the sessions exist. I don't think that we want to sort of prop up a kind of bummer sort of like cynical atmosphere. I think the
Yeah.
best way to approach this is sort of like we just got to keep doing what we've always been doing. Maybe there's more need for it now, maybe
Yes.
it's a little bit more relevant, but I don't think our core mission has ever really changed.
Yeah.
And I just love like the idea. That's what Mark Watney did. He didn't just sit there and go like, we're fucked. I'm just going to die here. There's nothing to be done. He was like, no, I need to solve these problems in spite of the fact that I'm facing resistance and obstacles. And I think that that's how all of us, not just those who are science kind of practitioners or science communicators, but all of us who are scientific thinkers and who care about things like the climate and who care about things like public education and healthcare, that's how we need to feel now. Like, don't get complacent. If there's ever a time to be an activist, or if there's ever a time to actually care and make sure your voice is heard, it's when you're starting to feel oppressed. And take a note out of Mark Watney's book.
Absolutely. And, I think that even broader than that, it's a good philosophy because, just in general, complaining about, complain how much of your time, it is okay to complain about stuff. It's okay to express fears, insecurities, and just complain about things. Do that. But not always. You spend a certain amount of time doing that and then get to work doing something about it or moving on with your life, address it and move on. And that's what he does.
So I just made an observation that's kind of depressing. So I'm on the West Coast. I'm in LA, and it's 1:31 p.m. right now while we're recording this on a Tuesday. Yes. You are on the East Coast. You're in North Carolina.
Yes.
And so that means
But I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina.
You're in Raleigh. Yes. You are in a nice
just like
pocket.
Austin, Texas.
Yes.
It's
nice
a little,
sea of blue, or island of blue.
Sanctuary in the middle of the state.
But I'm looking at the clock. That means that it is 4:31 p.m. where you are, and I can see on your webcam that it is getting dark outside.
I know, isn't that weird?
I hate it. Don't you hate it around wintertime because of daylight savings and stuff when it gets dark so early?
I don't like it. I never understood. I always had this idea that I don't know why exactly it's necessary, but if you're trying to make it lighter, the result is twice a year we do this. It all screws up and the end result is it still gets lighter early some part of the year and darker early some other part of the year. So exactly what is the point again? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I don't actually want you to answer. That's rhetorical.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many things that can be said about
what?
So many different facts we have to make.
I rarely know it's coming in advance. And one time, when I was not a science comedian, I was working in, I want to say Boise, Idaho, cool little town. And I went to so I didn't realize the time had changed. On that Sunday, probably. And I went to see a movie. And when I went, so here's what happened. I go up and I buy a ticket. And I asked, and I know what movie it was. It was that Lost in Space film, the reboot, the movie based on the older science fiction show. So I go in and I ask for a ticket for Lost in Space. And the first thing that might have tipped me off is they asked me which show. And it's like, that's weird because the one that's going to start in a little while, right?
Yeah.
Like, why did they ask me which showing? And I said,
because in your mind, you were there on time, not crazy early.
And then I bought my ticket. And I'm sure it was bewildering to them. Me and my friend walked over to the arcade games and started playing some video games to pass the time because we thought it was an hour earlier. And then we go, let's go in. And we walk in and the movie's on. And it's like, oh, it must have just started. It's like we totally missed the trailer. What happened? I don't know. And I'm watching and it's like I missed a significant amount of the movie, but it wasn't obvious. Maybe this is a measure, says something about the movie, but I was like, I felt like I did miss some part of some setup, and then I watched it, and then it ended. It was like, well, that was really short, and that's what put me off to it, because the movie wasn't even like, whatever. It was probably an hour. I only caught about an hour of it or something, or 45 minutes. I don't even know.
Did they did they give you a new ticket or anything because of the confusion of daylight saving?
I was probably too embarrassed to say anything, and I had a show to do, so I wasn't going to see another showing of it. I think it was just really bizarre. It took me a while to figure it out, and it was like, oh. So I was not in the loop about the time change.
Did you see that story? There was a trending story about twins that were born during the time change. So one of them was born and then the other was born
an hour
earlier.
Later?
No, an hour earlier, but it was younger. And so it was really confusing on the birth certificate. I know.
That's almost like a relativity thing. By the way, let me put a plug for a movie that hasn't been made yet, but it was supposed to be made by Ridley Scott a couple of years ago, based on a very classic science fiction book, The Forever War by Joe Haldeman.
Mm-hmm.
It won both the Hugo and the Nebula, the two big awards for science fiction books and stories and novellas and stuff. If I'm not mistaken, it won both. It is this classic book. He was a Vietnam vet, or he is a Vietnam vet, and a lot of that informs a lot of his work. And this classic book, it's called The Forever War because it's about an interstellar or intergalactic war between humans and these distant aliens, and a lot of the ships travel at relativistic velocities approaching the speed of light. There's also wormholes in it to make it possible, but the relevant part here is that, so like the wormholes to traverse a vast distance, but the significant thing is because they travel at relativistic velocities close to the speed of light, it affects the rate that time passes. So a guy signs up for a 4-year term in the military, but by the time his 4 years have passed, centuries have passed on Earth. So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And he goes back within his 4 years, he revisits Earth, or maybe after the 4 years, and he just signs up again. Because you go back to Earth, no one you know is there anymore. It's like, well, why not just re-up and do it some more? And then there's this fascinating idea, which is you and the aliens. Every time you meet the enemy, there's no way of knowing if you're evenly matched or if you have more advanced technology or they have more advanced technology, because you've both been traveling different amounts of time at different velocities.
Yeah.
So instead, this is not something that really exists in normal war, but because of that, when you meet an enemy, you may not be from the same time period, essentially.
That's crazy. So
as
they
soon
might
as
have
you
like
start
nukes and you have
they
like
might
muskets.
have something that you have no
crazy.
ability to defend against. So anyway, it was supposed to be made into a 3D film after Avatar, James Cameron's Avatar. Ridley Scott was going to make a 3D film of this. And then I guess, the way Hollywood is, the project moved on. Ridley Scott instead made Prometheus.
Yeah.
Not worthy of what this book could be. And I wish I could tell you who, but it's happening now. New people are attached to it.
Oh.
An actor who I forget. Who's the guy? Is it the guy in Jurassic Park? Who's the guy in Jurassic Park?
Which one?
The latest Jurassic Park film.
Chris Pratt.
No, I don't think it's Chris Pratt.
People love him.
Who was in that Jupiter Ascending?
Channing Tatum.
I think it's him.
Might have been him. He's a great actor. And you know what? It actually makes me feel good that potentially somebody else is directing it. And it's not a knock against Ridley Scott per se, because I actually know Ridley Scott and I think that he's really genius and he's done some just incredible work over the course of his career. But there is one thing that sticks in my craw about Ridley Scott, and that's that like he's overtly religious. Like you feel it in his pieces, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I can't, pretend that I know exactly what his religiosity is and if it's like straight line Christian or anything like that, but he is, more than anything else, he's just really obsessed with creation myths. And so you see that in a lot of his films, is they go back to this sort of, good and evil, kind of before there was knowledge and after there was knowledge, this sort of Planet of the Apes, I should say 2001: A Space Odyssey, sorry, like Obelisk, and then like now, this Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden kind of thing. And I don't love that. I feel like it just minimizes what good sci-fi could actually be. And so I'd like the idea of a really solid, beautiful sci-fi film not having to have any sort of God-like
I never made that observation.
Vibes to it.
Yeah. I never made that and because of, Gladiator, Thelma and Louise, The Martian, but because of Blade Runner and Alien, the original Alien. James Cameron did Alien 2, and then it moved on to other people too, but the original Alien and Blade Runner, that will just probably always be two of the best science fiction films. And now The Martian.
And so still relevant. That's the crazy thing, is you watch them and they totally stand up. And you cannot say that about a lot of science fiction,
Right.
They really stand up.
That's still
especially, I feel like Blade Runner had such
Yes.
foresight. There were so many things in that film that now you're like, oh, they knew. Like, how did they know?
I know. And you know what? So that's an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Well, I grew up reading the hard SF, but
Mm-hmm.
and I but later I started reading. There's a couple other people that Dick became my favorite, and he's not hard SF. He is weird and trippy, and it's not about the science accuracy at all. It is
Yeah.
about well, his two big themes are what it means to be human and
Mm.
what is reality. Like, what is reality when you have an android that thinks that doesn't even know it's an android, or you have worlds like uh, the Truman Show was not based on a Philip K. Dick book, but all Philip K. Dick fans link
Love
it
that.
to an
Yeah.
early novel of Dick's, and it's because it's so Phil Dickian is a term. Some of us dickheads. I'm not making that up. I am not self-professed. Like you gladly take on the term nerd or
Yeah.
geek.
Uh-huh.
Philip K.
You're a
Dick fans
dickhead.
are dickheads, and Phil Dickian is a fun word. And the Truman Show is very Phil Dickian in that he has no idea that he's living in this fake world.
Yeah. It feels very Black Mirror, like Charlie
Yeah.
Brooker's Black Mirror. Have you seen
Very
any of
much.
those episodes?
Yes, I just haven't seen the new season.
They're so, oh, you have to watch the new.
Yes.
It's so stunning. It's got that Twilight Zone vibe, but it also has that kind of that self-reflective sort of theme to it, which of course, that's what I love about sci-fi. And so it's interesting that you make the disconnect between hard sci-fi and sort of soft sci-fi, meaning that like hard sci-fi is like all about scientific accuracy. I might make a different distinction and say I really like sci-fi that doesn't delve into fantasy. I like sci-fi that kind of just sticks with what's possible, but I do like it when it gets a little trippy and philosophical and political. I love, Vonnegut and Bradbury, and they're like
me too.
witches and stuff in some of
And
Bradbury's.
yeah, and they're not like that. You know what? So everyone should read Slaughterhouse-Five, which is one of Vonnegut's books that has, he has varying degrees of what you might call science fiction in his books, but
and
that
he never,
one is
yeah.
Well, you know what? One that fewer people know, it's, oh my God, I just flashed on the name. It's The Sirens of Titan.
Okay.
The Sirens of Titan is even more of a science fiction book, and it's hilarious in that Vonnegut way, and I highly recommend. And I there's a thing I would love to tell you, but it gives too much away to say.
You
It's
can't.
too much
You
of a
can't give it
spoiler.
away.
And
Sirens
but
of
it's
Titan.
so good. The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut.
Ooh,
Jr.
I'm going to do like a horrible name droppy situation, but it won't really even feel name droppy. I was invited by Stephen Paul Leva. He's a science fiction writer here in LA. He's pretty prolific, and he was really close to Ray Bradbury.
Oh yeah.
And so I was invited this year to speak at Ray Bradbury Day. There's a square in downtown LA that's Ray
Nice.
Bradbury Square, and we have a Ray Bradbury Day, and we all read excerpts from our favorite stories of his. His daughters were there, and they read some excerpts. I read a little bit from The Veldt, which is a story in The Illustrated Man, which I loved as a child. And a gentleman came up to me, and I feel really bad that I don't know his name, but a gentleman came up to me and offered me, this is so weird, a piece of Ray Bradbury's house. And I was like, what does that mean? And he was like, well, before they tore down, I guess, this house or did renovations or something, they took like tidbits of his office, like pieces of the wall. Like there's some brick pieces and some drywall pieces, and they put them in baggies and like gave them to people to whom
Yeah,
Ray
like people have a
Bradbury-
piece of the Berlin Wall.
Exactly.
You have a piece of Bradbury's house. For a moment, I thought you were going to say ashes.
No, just his house. But it's super weird. I have a Ziploc bag with a chunk of the wall of his study, and no shit, it doesn't say my name on the bag. It says Guillermo because they took it for Guillermo del Toro, but he wanted
Really?
one of the bricks instead. So they gave
Wow.
him a brick, and I ended up with Guillermo del Toro's piece of
that's
Ray
interesting.
Bradbury's drywall.
You know what I haven't said on anything like a show before is that so this other guy that I absolutely love, Roger Zelazny, is one of the as Joe Haldeman is one of the grandmasters of science fiction. It's a term, and there's only maybe 40 or 50 that have been named that are just these classic science fiction writers. He is not so much hard SF, and some of his stuff is fantasy, but some of it's fantasy with like the kind of fantasy a science fiction writer would write, is all I can say.
That makes
and
sense.
he's such an amazing writer with such a knowledge of history and mythology that his stuff's beautiful, and he won an incredible amount of Hugos and Nebulas. He's everyone knows that. I mean, not, And so there's another writer I love.
Yeah.
His classic series is called it's the Amber series. Nine Princes in Amber is the first book, and it's an amazing book. But so much of his stuff is very prolific. Dead now. And there's a writer I love that's not science fiction. He was a poet and prose writer whose prose has his best poetry. His name was Richard Brautigan, Brautigan, Brautigan. Richard Brautigan, contemporary of Vonnegut's. He's often described as late for the beats and early for the hippies. And I once bought a book of his called Sombrero Fallout, and in the front page or two, the opening pages, Roger Zelazny's name is written in it. And you know what? I've Googled it. It appears to be Roger Zelazny's signature. Like, I think I own one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors that was previously owned by another one of my favorite authors. And they're all dead. It's so cool.
Isn't that crazy? That's why I love old books. That's why that's one of the reasons that I can't move over to like the Kindle.
Me too.
I do listen to audiobooks periodically, but it is so important for me to have real tangible books, and they fill my home. And I have this thing where like I actually have a book from an ex-boyfriend. It's really sweet. It's a copy of Oliver Sacks's Musicophilia, and he wrote in the front, it's the funniest inscription, and I'm totally paraphrasing, but it's something along the lines of like, a book about music and brain science. If only there were dinosaurs in it, it would have been written just for you. I also know how much you like for people to inscribe your books, which means I've now wrapped this twice.
That's nice.
Which is like amazing. Yeah. So, and if you look at all of them, you will see, like, if you just go through the books on my shelf, you'll see that so many of them have either been signed by the original authors or they were purchased for me by friends as gifts, and my friends have written inside of them and put the date. And to me, that's just so meaningful. It's, I don't know, it's so touching when you open up a book after you've not seen it for a while, and it brings back this flood of memories of where you were and who you were with when you first read it or when you first received it.
Can I say, you know what? When I moved from San Francisco to Raleigh, and I had to get rid of a lot of stuff, and you're moving, and so many people are like, well, the first thing you do is get rid of all your books and get ebooks. And I'm like,
hell
you
no.
don't know me. Sorry. What's your next suggestion? Because
exactly.
that's not
the books are the first to go. Like, the books are coming with me no matter what I do. Yeah. And they really do, I think, bring back these wonderful memories of like, they help me kind of, I don't know, contextualize my year, sort of a year in review. I remember what I read and where I went. Right. I've been traveling a little bit this year, a little less than usual. I got to go to Manchester. I'm not sure if I got to do any other international travel, mostly travel around the U.S. Most of my travel is linked to the work that I do. But you got to do some incredible travel in 2016, right?
And you know what? I've traveled the U.S. as a comedian. I've performed in almost all. I haven't hit Hawaii, but I have done Alaska, and the rest of the continental U.S., the contiguous ones, I've hit almost every one. Not quite, but over 40, I think, in the course of my career. But internationally, I'm not as well traveled. But so I got to go to 3 countries this year on one trip that I've never been to, and they were Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. Actually, we were briefly in Austria too, but I don't even know where to start. It all, what I love is that it came from me choosing to go to a conference that I actually had to. Usually I only go to conferences that hire me, but I wanted to go to the AAAS conference this year, which is the American Advancement for the
American Association for the Advancement of Science, or is it the Academy for the Advancement?
No,
I think it's the Association.
It's the American It's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I was invited to be on a panel about communicating science with humor. And someone came up to me after my panel, and she was from Germany, and she wanted me to come to this event. And before I even knew what it was, I was absolutely certain I wanted to go. And then she told me it's the Lindau Nobel laureate meeting. And in Lindau, Germany, which is this idyllic, this quaint little town in southern Germany, right on Lake
Mm-hmm.
Constance. And for 66 years, they have been bringing Nobel laureates. Once a year, they bring a group of Nobel laureates to town and a much larger group of young scientists to be mentored by them for a week, not just to listen to their lectures, but to have lunch and dinner with them. And it's
Wow.
interactive. Ask them about work-life balance. It's not just about the science. It's about every part about being a scientist. So this year, there are there are basically three Nobel Prizes in the sciences: physics, chemistry, and medicine physiology. So this year
Mm.
was physics. They brought in 29 Nobel laureates and 400 young physicists from 80 countries. And
Wow.
most of whom, they all have to speak a little English, but it doesn't have to be their first language. And so my audience, which also included the president of Austria, was a bunch of jet lagged young physicists from all over the world. And I was invited to perform for about 15 minutes or so. And I took the opportunity because I had a trip to Europe and a gig. I'm there with all these amazing scientists, and there's a big screening process. The young physicists are, top in their field, but there are some undergrads, some grad students, some postdocs. You have to be under 35 because it's about mentoring the next generation.
Gotcha.
But there are undergrads up through postdocs, and postdocs, of course, are people that already have their PhD. It's almost like a residency for an MD. A lot of people know doctors have a kind of residency before they get their full-time job. So same with scientists. A postdoc is an early stage scientist. And I wanted to interview as many as I could. So I interviewed a bunch of Nobel laureates, including Stephen Chu, who was energy secretary for 4 years under Obama. And George Smoot is one of the guys
Oh,
there.
wow.
And there were a couple
Yeah.
other people. Vince Cerf was there as kind of a guest. He's a computer scientist, so he's not a Nobel laureate. But
I interviewed
but
him once about Alan Turing.
and isn't he the most amazing, wonderful man?
He's incredible.
He's
Yeah.
and yeah, he's called one of the fathers of the internet. He helped develop the protocols that the internet is based on.
Yeah.
So
Incredible.
I loved him, and I interviewed a bunch of young people, and I spent 4 or 5 days there, and I loved it. And while I was there, though, I contacted someone at CERN, and the press office set me up in Geneva. Next, I went to Geneva for really just one day, and I spent a full day at CERN, which is like the European Science Agency, and that's where the Large Hadron Collider is, the LHC, where the Higgs
Hmm.
boson was discovered, among other things. And they gave me tours. I went inside a neutrino detector, and
Cool.
I got to interview a bunch of people about different particle physics. And then at that Sci-Fu conference that I mentioned earlier, held at the Googleplex in 2008, I met a man named, Guy Consolmagno, but his name is Brother Guy Consolmagno. He's a Jesuit brother. He's an
Hmm.
astronomer. And at the time, he was working for the Vatican. His title was beautiful. He was curator of the Vatican meteorite collection. Did you
That's
know the
awesome.
Vatican? Who knew the Vatican had a meteorite collection and he was the curator? And what amazing, how cool would that be on your business card? And he is an American. He has an Italian name, but he's MIT educated and Harvard and Arizona. And he's actually a planetary scientist, I think, sort of jealous. He studies meteorites.
Hmm.
Well, last year, at the end of 2015, he was named director of the Vatican Observatory. But
That's
ever since I met him
crazy.
8 years ago, I thought, wow, what if one day I could visit him in Italy at the Vatican Observatory? And he travels a lot. So he was not there when I was in Germany. But by the time I was done in Geneva, he was there. And I spent 4 days in this little town of Castel Gandolfo, about 15 miles outside of Rome, where the Pope's, it was called the Pope's summer home, but apparently this Pope does not use it as a summer home. So, but the Vatican Observatory is there. And when you enter the grounds of the Vatican Observatory, you go through this amazing gate. And just like in Rome, in the Vatican, you're no longer in Italy when you pass through that gate. You're
Yeah.
now on that like Vatican territory. I forget how they call it. And I spent a few days there, and then I had an interview with him. Me, an agnostic Jew, and him, a Catholic, a Jesuit man of God.
Mm.
And both science, he's a big science and science fiction geek and a film geek. And in fact, the first 2 nights that I was there, I got to experience movie night with them. And I just think it would be very surprising when I tell you what movies we watched at the Vatican Observatory.
Yes, please. What did you watch?
Well, so here's what they do. They have a small collection of DVDs, and someone will choose 3 options, and then they decide from there. Like, for instance, I chose 3, and one they had just watched the week before.
Mhm.
So that's like their system. So I was the guest, so I chose 3 films. And the one we ended up watching, I had never seen, but he's seen many times. He's a huge anime fan, and this Miyazaki's film called Howl's Moving Castle. So
That's
there you go.
awesome.
Yeah, and he's very familiar with it, and I was seeing it for the first time. And same the next night, it's almost embarrassing that I always meant to see this film. It's the concert film of the Talking Heads, Stop Making Sense.
No,
That
you guys
goes
did
all the
not
way back
watch
to the
that.
80s. And we totally watched it. And
That's
in fact,
awesome.
he feels it's a very spiritual film. And I even asked him, it's like, well, what about isn't rock and roll the devil's music? And not at all. He laughs at that. And I guess, I don't even know much about Judaism. I know nothing about other religions, frankly. I'm not
Yeah.
proud of that. I'm just saying I have limited bandwidth, and that's stuff I've never learned about. And so Catholics and Jesuits are very pro-education. And there's a long history of their contributions to, it's a Vatican astronomer that came up with the term Big Bang. It's a Vatican astronomer that first turned astronomy and astrophysics by examining the spectra of stars. Before that, I am told that astronomy was largely just, cataloging locations to be used for navigation, for instance.
Interesting. So it's more useful than sort of
Yes.
exploration for the sake of exploration.
He put the light from stellar objects through, a spectroscope, and then then here on Earth, taking elements and, heating them up and then comparing the spectra. So
I
that's.
thought it was a woman who first did that.
I don't know which part. So,
I'm looking up.
Let's Google this and find a little more. But
it may not have been
I wish I
stars,
knew
it
his
may have been
name.
something
Yeah,
else.
certainly part of this. So that was fantastic. And there was about a dozen. There were about a dozen Vatican astronomers. He's now the director, and he doesn't see his mission. I don't know. I think his mission is mostly just to do good science, actually.
Yeah.
And certainly, he worships in whatever way he worships. And I'm sure that his work is a form of worship to him.
Yeah.
But it's not like he's always proselytizing or anything. He's just trying to do good science, but in this context of whatever else he does there. But outreach and stuff. But he's really fun and funny, and he's a big science fiction geek, and he's a movie and music geek. So
I love that. So he's
Yeah.
like a human being.
he's
basically.
a total human. And so I think that was great. And I'm always in the same way that I'd like to turn people onto science who don't think science is interesting or fun. I want to change their minds, and I want to show them it's like, no. And they think it's hard. It's like, sure, science can get very hard. But at the core of it, I'm not a scientist. And I just, there's a lot of science you can learn that doesn't get hard, and it's fascinating, and it's like, and all it is curiosity. How can you not even be interested? It's just curiosity about this world we find ourselves on. And
Yeah, it gets complicated the deeper you dig into it.
yes,
But that is a function of digging deeper. You know what
it
I
shouldn't
mean?
stop anyone from learning some.
No, and at its most kind of genuine and basic level, I think a lot of what's quote hard about it is the fact that there are language barriers. It's that there's terminology that's complicated if you don't already know it. It's that much of science uses the language of math. So if you don't already have a strong understanding of mathematical principles, then the science itself starts to get complicated. But I do think that these are just functions of
Of how
digging
deep you
deeper.
dig.
Yeah,
I totally agree, because even like since you said that, it's like you don't have to know any math to learn a ton about science. So you shouldn't be intimidated by it. I feel like I don't know who I'm talking to right now because I'm sure your fans are fans of science.
Most of them, yeah. But I know for a fact that I have some listeners who are like, I know nothing about science. I just like interesting people.
So there's plenty to know. Like I like thinking of things that you wouldn't even think that if you ask someone, when you get out of a pool or a shower and you're wet and you're cold, why are you cold? I think most people might just think, well, I'm wet. That's why I'm cold, because I'm wet. But that's obviously not an answer. And I love that there's like a real physics or chemistry explanation, which what it is that water evaporates off your skin. And that process of evaporation is an endothermic reaction. And that's there. So there's the language thing. But all that means is it takes energy to make the water droplets that are liquid on your skin. You have to add energy to make them become a gas and evaporate. Well, that energy comes from your skin. So it's heat. So you lose heat to the water, and that's why we feel cold. So I love
which is why sweating actually helps us cool off.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think I'd like to, I need to ask a physicist this. Probably Derek Muller would be a good guy to ask.
Yeah.
I like him, and he's a great science communicator. But I'm pretty sure this too, that fans, the wind, the reason you're chilly when the wind is blowing, and the reason a fan in a room can help cool you off is because I think the air around your body, you can only lose a certain amount of heat to the air around you. But if the wind blows that air away, then you can lose even more heat to this fresh wind.
Yeah,
I
think that's
basically
kind of cloud
the idea.
Right
so
around
why you get cold is, again, it's like you wouldn't realize. Some people might not know that right underneath this sort of intuitive thing is a real sciencey explanation, and it's not hard to understand.
Yeah, underneath everything. That's the great thing, is that science is literally everywhere. And speaking of science being everywhere, I did look up the spectroscopy history, and I was thinking of Margaret Huggins, who in 1860 or in the 1860s first used spectroscopy to actually determine the elements that are given that the stars are made of. So they were able to compare this the spectroscope from the stars.
And do you know who I was talking about?
And you were probably talking about super early on. So obviously Newton was the first person to really fully describe a spectroscope. But there were early, like in the 1600s, there were experiments by Kircher and Marcy and Boyle and Grimaldi that were
I think it's Grimaldi.
That.
Who's Grimaldi? Is he a Vatican astronomer?
I'm not sure, but let me look him up. That predated even
familiar.
some of Newton's first experiments. And since those often dealt with the sun, I mean, he sure do look like he's from the Vatican. He's an Italian Jesuit priest.
Yes, he might be the guy that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, in Bologna.
That first analyzed the spectra of stars, and astronomy became astrophysics. Very interesting.
I mean, this is crazy. Like, this is like early work in the 1600s. Wow. And we forget sometimes that the sun is a star. So they were able to work on spectra of our star long before they could pick up the spectra of other stars.
Because you had to use a telescope and then feed that into a spectroscope somehow.
Yeah,
so
and just having basic, I mean, back then they were just using prisms, like really simple calculations based on prisms and rainbows. Like, they didn't have advanced computational technology.
You mentioned the prism, and I remember hearing something about, I was thinking that, we know that Newton is the one that figured out white light is composed of these component colors.
Yeah.
And you can put white light through a prism, and you see these colors. You could put the colors back into a prism and recreate white light. Well, so I had this thought. It's like, did Newton invent the prism, or was the prism brand new? Because it seems so obvious. You put light through it, you put white light through its sunlight, and you see these colors. It seems like anyone could have discovered that. And I thought, so either Newton invented the prism or it was just invented. Well, you know what? That's not what it was.
What
it was is they saw this effect. White light went in and colors came out. They thought the prism was creating those colors. Yeah. They didn't, but Newton analyzed it methodically. He did those both things. He put sunlight in, and he got these separate colors. And then he took those separate colors and he put them through prisms, and they didn't separate into anything.
Yeah.
And then he probably also did the colored light in I don't know if he could
to
do
make
that.
white light.
Yeah,
Well, and
but
that's
he
the
did
crazy
do that.
thing.
He was a little more methodical, and then he was like, "Oh no, it's not an effect of the prism. This is a quality of light."
And we talk about it like, oh, you put white light in. But back in the day, like the idea of white light, like that's nothing.
Right.
That's just the ambient. Like this is when like ether was a thing. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like
Yes.
ectoplasm was still a thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, what is white light? That's just like air to them. You know what I mean? And these are the things that we sometimes forget. Like we know that the light that reaches us from the sun is put off by the sun. We understand that these are photons, like these individual packets of information
Yeah.
that are traveling to us over, thousands of years. But this is not something that was intuitive
No. And you know
back
what,
at
in
a
fact-
time when religion trumped all and everybody thought
Right.
about things as being these kind of creation stories. And we didn't have like a good germ theory of disease yet. Like this was a long time ago.
Yeah, in fact, I have a very entertaining story about Louis Pasteur and the germ theory of disease.
Mhm.
And the only reason I have it is because, name dropping in progress, because when I contributed some pieces to Neil deGrasse Tyson's radio show, Star Talk Radio, and the first piece he assigned me, his shows are themed, and the theme was wine, and I had nothing on it
Yeah.
until I dug. He pushed me. He's an interesting educator, and he pushed me to come up with something and challenged me essentially in a way that I couldn't say no to. And I
He has
came
that
up with
effect
this
on people.
Yeah. I mean, I came up with this story and made it entertaining. And that's the thing. So I was going to throw one thing out there because of something you just said. Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Non-intuitive things. If
Yeah.
you ever have any ideas like this, or any of your listeners, I'm very easy to find through my website, sciencecomedian.com. There's a contact page. I'm fascinated by things that couldn't be more obvious, but are wrong. And
Gotcha.
the obvious, I don't think you can do any better than clearly the earth is flat.
Yeah.
Well, no. Clearly the sun goes around the earth. Nothing could be more obvious throughout history that the sun goes around the earth.
But
The
it's
earth
so
being flat
utterly
also.
wrong.
And then it turns out to
Yeah.
be absolutely wrong. So I love the idea in any field of science, something that we assumed to be absolutely, you didn't even question it. And it
Mhm.
turns out to be completely wrong. So if anyone has any examples, I'd love to hear them.
Absolutely, guys. As Brian said, you should reach out to him at his website, sciencecomedian.com, not the science comedian, just sciencecomedian.com.
Well, I own the sciencecomedian.
Oh, good. So it all forwards too.
But
Okay,
it's-
that's
no,
genius.
just sciencecomedian.com. But let me just, because I just finished working at a science museum for 4 years. I quit earlier this year to return to freelancing. So I'm available for projects. But what I want to say is my website is in dire need of being updated. So
Oh, good to know. If
like the
anybody has any
blog,
opinions or insights about that too.
Exactly. My most recent blog post is from when I started, right before I started working at the museum 4 years ago. So,
Well, and that's tough when you move into doing something full time and working for an institution, which is a great opportunity and gives you a lot of security. And then you go back to freelance, everything's in disarray, and you forget how much you have to do everything yourself and how much every forward facing
exactly.
object is so important, right? So you've got your website where people can see your work. You're also obviously pretty prolific on social media. So Science Comedian on Twitter.
Science Comedian's my handle everywhere.
Science
YouTube.
Comedian on Facebook. YouTube also.
Yeah, and on Facebook, I have a personal page and a fan page. So Brian Malow and Science Comedian Brian Malow. And, on YouTube, I really need to develop my YouTube channel too. And Derek Muller is very inspirational that way. At Psych, we didn't really talk that much more about the content of SciComm Camp, but I came early to do a workshop with him, and it was very inspiring because he's a very successful science communicating YouTuber.
Yeah.
But I do have, like, my most recent videos are a sample of my stand-up.
Oh, great. So
And
people can see your work there.
And some clips from my Skype interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And those are pretty entertaining. I edited them, and they're pretty entertaining, I'd
And
say.
good. And that shows a real sample of kind of who you are and what your aesthetic is. So, everybody, you can obviously check out Brian's work online at his website and his YouTube. You can reach out to him directly via Facebook and Twitter and bug him and tell him
Yes.
how much you like his work. And, Brian, what's next
I'm no
for
longer
you?
available for weddings and bar mitzvahs. That's the classic funny thing comedians like to say. But it's like, you know what? At a certain point, you go, no, I mean, if, you know, if you wanted me to perform at your wedding, obviously I'm available.
That's so
But
sweet.
and I don't think you're getting bat mitzvahed anytime. But
No, probably not.
but yeah, if you got a science conference,
For
I'm
sure.
there.
Yeah. And so those are great opportunities, great gigs. Obviously, science conferences, but also a lot of corporate events are
Yeah.
really good opportunities for doing
And
good
I expect
stand-up.
what I plan. I left the museum where I worked in science communications for 4 years. I love interviewing scientists. That's what I largely did there, on stage or on video or audio. So what I expect to be doing in the near future is a combination of performing, doing. I give talks to scientists to be better science communicators,
Mhm.
and writing and audio and video projects. So I expect in the near future to be developing my YouTube channel a little more.
Cool, cool.
And also more when I was in Europe, I dipped my toe into live streaming on Facebook, and I expect
Such a great
to do
resource.
more. Yeah. So that's what's coming from me. Look for me there. Follow me on Facebook, I guess.
Absolutely. And I almost forgot. I can't let you leave without answering the final two questions that I ask everybody who comes on my
cool.
show. And
All
I
right.
apologize in advance because they're like pretty deep, pretty big picture questions.
Well, I mean, I don't have a lot of money, but I could loan you like 30, 40. I don't know. That's not the.
So, no,
sorry.
not that good. So, there's sort of two sides of the same coin, really. The first question being, when you think about the future, in whatever context matters to you, whether it's your own personal future, the future of the planet, the future of humanity, whatever. The first question is, what is the thing that, concerns you the most, that keeps you up the most at night and really worries you? And on the flip side of that, just so we don't end on a completely depressing note, what are you most kind of hopeful and excited about when you look to the future?
Okay. Well, it's funny. I think a lot of people would say if you asked me that a few weeks ago, it might not be the same answer as it is today.
Seriously.
It's like I politics is not a passion of mine, but humanity is, and science is, and I'm arguably a white male. I'm Jewish. Ask the KKK how white I am, and you'll get a different answer. So it's like I've often like to say that to like a black friend. It's like, hey, I'm as black as you, and you're as Jewish as me, to the KKK.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I really am concerned about climate change. And the funny thing is, there's this idea of how you frame it. You can win an argument by being the one who frames the argument. And the climate change argument got framed as, can you prove humans are causing global warming? And first of all, yes, it is very well proven. But that's a way higher bar than I need, because totally separate from global warming, separate from the temperature change, is for the past 100 years and more, we've been spewing poison. And I don't even like to say into the atmosphere. Atmosphere is too sciencey a word. It's our air supply. We've been spewing poisons into the atmosphere from industry, into the water. It's our air supply. And I know it seems like a big planet, but if you look at it from space, the atmosphere is this very thin. The Earth is 8,000 miles in diameter. The atmosphere is like 100 miles high. That is it's an onion skin layer.
Yeah.
Just that it's barely clinging because of gravity. There's this I'm fascinated by this. If you ever think about it, just that the Earth has clinging to it this atmosphere, and that's our biosphere. And we've been, come on, it's like you think it's big, but it's finite, and we've been spewing stuff into it. So yes, we've significantly increased the amount of CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases. And so they are trapping heat, and the percentage of CO2 in our atmosphere is small, and we have changed it significantly. So this is very well established. So there's that. But we're also, it's like, why don't we clean up the atmosphere because it's our air supply? And why shouldn't we switch to cleaner fuels? And it also means, obviously, it means it's not a financial problem. It's going to open huge new industries. So yeah, climate change and poisoning the planet um, is a big concern of mine. And now I'm really, really concerned about. I'm a Jew, and I've heard of Nazi Germany. And you know what?
Yeah.
These people, just like lately, all this hand raising, the Heil Hitler salute and this Nazi
Ugh.
stuff. It's like, are we? It's like these people, I think they're patriots. That is not
Yeah, and it's
patriotism.
getting
That's not
normalized in the
America. In
media.
fact, America fought the Nazis. Do you not remember that our revered veterans fought Nazi Germany? And those ideals are not American ideals at
Yeah.
all. So
Yeah.
that scares me, and I want to see us that and on a more positive thing,
Yeah, what are you
ever
looking
since I
forward
was
to?
well, ever since I was a kid, reading science fiction, me and my friend Chuck, we would read these stories and then we'd lay out on the grass and look up at the sky and fantasize, like look out into space and think about all the possibilities. And it always used to kind of make me sad because back then I realized some of this stuff is going to happen. Space travel and all these amazing technologies, possible alien contact. Then eventually I thought it's going to happen, but I don't think I'm going to live to see it. Well,
Oh,
what did happen is we've seen so many other amazing things that we didn't see. We didn't see computers being reduced to handheld devices, and there's just so many amazing technologies and incredible developments we've seen, and socially too, probably.
yeah,
Um,
that's
like
true. I mean,
whether,
I think we're feeling most threatened right now because we have made so much progress and we hate to see that
right.
progress go backward.
I moved from San Francisco to North Carolina. And the first thing they did that says you're not in San Francisco is they made a state amendment against gay marriage.
Mhm.
And then it's always been this battle. And then all of a sudden, when the U.S. Supreme Court deal went through, it was like, here's this battle that was raging. And then I didn't even know it was being fought. And then one day it's like, guess what? Now we have gay marriage
Yep.
completely nationally and all your laws are irrelevant. And it's like, wow, I think that's very hopeful. I have a cousin that I haven't even met yet, and him and his husband just had a daughter through a surrogate just a couple weeks ago. And I'm hopeful about more. It's like more advances in science and
Mhm.
technology and socially. And maybe they're tied together too. Because in a lot of, in Lindau, Germany, one woman I met, one of the very, very young scientists, was a young woman from I want to an African country. I want to say Nigeria. I could be wrong, but an African
Mhm.
country, and she studies communications and optics, like some kind of like light and
Mhm.
communications. And her motivation is that she wants to bring better communication to her country because communication means power. And
Yeah.
she wants to help. And oh my God. So she's passionate about science and she's really passionate about helping the world, but especially her people that suffer from, they don't have the kind of internet access we have. And so that kind of thing, when I saw these 400 young physicists there and the groups of young scientists that come there every year, they're not just, the Nobel Prize is not just granted. Alfred Nobel funded those with the fortune he made from dynamite. Okay. And he really wanted to do something great. And he spoke multiple languages. He was fairly worldly. And it's written into the DNA of the Nobels that it's not just for a great scientific discovery. It's for advances in science that help mankind. That is specifically in the definition
Yeah.
and of the requirement. And what I saw was that the Nobel Prize winners I met and all these young scientists from undergrad to postdoc, they all share that. They were so passionate about science and so passionate about serving mankind. So that was that was really exciting and cause for a lot of optimism. And the science community, we've seen a rise of science communicators as well and people consuming it. Cosmos. Neil Tyson went from like 1 million Twitter followers to about 5 million by the
Mhm.
time Cosmos had aired 13 episodes, something like that. So I skew towards the optimistic. Maybe it's naive, but because sometimes I'm doubtful, but there's a lot of causes for optimism, I think. The rise of Elon Musk, like that guy set out. Do you know that he specifically, after college, he was like, he wanted to make a contribution to mankind? Who even thinks that way? And
Yeah.
so he identified 3 areas: the internet, space travel, because he wanted humans to become a multi-planet species, and green energy. So
And
he
he is
has the
well on
Tesla
his
electric
way
car
to all of
company.
those.
He's got this amazing SpaceX, this amazing private space company, and he's involved in Solar City, this solar panel company. And his first
Tesla.
developments were in the internet. So I do find a lot of cause for optimism.
Absolutely. Brian, thank you so much for joining
Was that the
me.
were there those the 2 questions?
Those were the 2 questions, and
Okay, good.
you kicked their asses.
Thank you. That's what I do. I kick questions' asses.
Thank you so much for
And thank
joining
you
me
so
on the
much.
show.
Thanks for doing this.
And for hanging out with me all weekend. It was so much fun.
That was so much fun. Thanks. Keep doing it. It was so much fun. I hope I can be there next year too.
Yeah, for sure. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.